I was doing some testing on Daredevil, and I discovered something that I don't think anyone else is aware of, because I haven't seen it mentioned in any videos or any posts anywhere by anyone, and that is Daredevil can do over 200 damage to a target with a single attack. Not a combo, a single attack. And to be clear, this isn't some gimmicky thing where you need a Mantis damage buff and a Storm damage buff, and you need to have Cloak and Dagger, use Terror Wave on the enemy, none of that stuff. Daredevil can do this by himself, and it's not a super rare thing that only happens once in a blue moon. You can do this technique a whole bunch of times in every single one of your matches. This allows you to do something like this. What you just saw was an Adam Warlock get completely and utterly annihilated with only 2 moves, the Devil's Throw into Righteous Cross, and for the record, that combo took about half a second in order to eliminate that Adam Warlock, which I believe now holds the record for the fastest combo elimination. Now, every video I've seen on Daredevil always says the same thing. Initiate with the throw, but when you get in close, use the chain because it does more damage than the throw. As you can see, the chain does 84, and then the throw does 68. Granted, the throw will spread the damage around, but if you're trying to focus down a support, you want to maximize that damage. Therefore, always use the chain, because it does more damage. Except, I just showed you, that's not true. In fact, that's not true at all. Alright, so let me show you how to do this technique. There's actually 2 different versions, and they're both very easy, but it's dependent on how far away the enemies are from each other, because I'm sure many of you have already figured this out. It requires 2 different enemies in proximity. They don't need to be right next to each other, like the Groot and the Adam Warlock here. They can be more spaced out. The maximum distance between the 2 players is 6 meters, which is actually quite a bit. If you look at a lot of the different maps, many of the supports are going to be jammed up right next to each other, or you can have tanks and DPS that are next to each other. So finding 2 players that are within 6 meters is extremely common. I think one of the reasons why no one else has figured this out is because the technique itself is very unintuitive. In order to get the maximum amount of damage, you need to deliberately miss your target. Now, this isn't like the Devil's Chain where you have to aim at their feet in order to max out your damage. With this Devil's Throw, you need to intentionally miss the target completely. Your crosshair cannot be on the target that you want to damage in order to get the max damage, which is just a very weird thing to do for a ranged ability. And we're not talking about a little bit of damage either. Remember, normal damage with the Devil's Throw is 68, but most of the time, you're going to get 136, which is double, and sometimes, if you set it up properly, you can even get 204 damage, which is triple the amount you would normally get. For very obvious reasons, I'm going to name this technique the ground bounce, and as I said, there are 2 versions. Version number 1 is when the enemy are closer together. This is 3 meters or less. In this example, I'm trying to do the maximum amount of damage to the Punisher, so I want him to be in the middle of the other character, in this case Luna, and the ground bounce, which is going to be off to the right-hand side. Now, it doesn't need to be in a very specific spot. It can be right next to him. It can be a meter or 2 away. You don't want to have it too far away, but it needs to be off to the side so that it creates a line. You want the ground bounce, the Punisher, and the Luna to be in a line together. And the reason for this is how the extra damage works, how it adds up. And I'll talk about that after I'm done the second version. So for this first version, when the enemy are close together, you want to put that ground bounce a little bit off to the side of your primary target. Moving on to version number 2. This is when the enemy are a little bit further away from each other, 4, 5, or 6 meters, with 6 being the max. It doesn't really work anything beyond that. Then you're going to use version 2. Instead of putting the ground bounce on the outside, you put it in between the 2 players. But this is a little more difficult than version 1 because you have to be more precise with the ground bounce location. It can't just be anywhere in between those 2 targets. It has to be about 1 character width away from the target that you want to do the most damage to. In this case, it's going to be Punisher. If I had placed this over on the left-hand side, then Luna would have taken most of the damage instead of the Punisher. So what's going on here? Why is the ground bounce technique dealing so much extra damage to one of the targets? Because remember, the throw only deals 34 damage per hit, and it has a maximum of 4 bounces. That's why when you throw it directly at the Punisher, he takes 34 damage, it bounces to Luna, she takes 34, bounces back to Punisher, 34, and back to Luna for another 34. Both players take 68 damage total. But with the ground bounce, that's not what's happening. The Luna is, in all of the cases, still getting hit twice and still taking 68 damage, but most of the time, the Punisher is taking 136 damage, which means 4 bounces, or sometimes he takes 204 damage, which is 6 bounces. I have a couple of theories for why there's so much extra damage. If you target a player directly with the Devil's Throw, the game only has to calculate point A and point B. The target you hit, point A, and a nearby player, point B. So it goes from A to B, back to A, back to B, and then it's over. Each player takes 34 damage times 2, 68 total, and that's it. But when you ground bounce this ability, it adds point C. And I think this is where that extra damage comes from, or at least some of it. Because when it's bouncing from point C to Luna, it's passing through the Punisher. And for whatever weird reason, it's adding an extra instance of damage, which is why the Punisher takes 4 bounces worth of damage for a total of 136, and Luna is still taking the 68 from 2 bounces. And it gets even weirder when they're right next to each other, because that wouldn't fully explain it. It also doesn't quite explain version 2, but it's just something weird with the calculation. Because of that third point, it's adding extra damage. Maybe there's also some sort of small AoE effect, like the Punisher is close enough to the Luna that when the Luna gets hit, the Punisher is also registering as the ricochet, and that's why he takes 6 instances of the bounce damage for a total of 204. I'm not quite certain, but for whatever reason, adding that third point, adding the ground bounce, drastically increases the damage of whatever your primary target is. So, if you're trying to burst down, focus down a single target, and there happens to be another player that's close by, you absolutely want to use the Devil's Throw, because you're going to do either 136 damage, potentially 204 if you're lucky and they're really close together. But I mean, in most cases, you're going to do 136 damage. And compare that to the Devil's Chain, which is only 84. Now, of course, this considers the fact that you don't need the extra health from the Devil's Chain ability. If you don't need that, then you can use the throw. If you do need the extra health for whatever reason, then obviously you're going to want to default to the chain. In general, if there's 2 targets and you want to do the maximum amount of damage, Devil's Throw is the thing to do. So I showed you how the ground bounce works with 2 enemy players, but what about 3 or 4 or 5, or even the whole team of 6? Unfortunately, it gets worse as you add more players. So with 3, your chances of getting a high number of bounces on your primary target goes down. With 4, there's pretty much no chance. And same thing with 5 and 6 players. If you have more than 2 players in the area, you're probably not going to get any high number of bounces on your primary target. You can still get 136 damage if there's 3 players, but after that, it's just not going to happen. So 3 enemy players can work, but 2 enemy players is the ideal situation. One final thing about the ground bounce technique. I don't know if this is working as intended. I don't know if this is a bug, and if it is, when the developers are going to get around to fixing it. But in the meantime, it's really good. You do a lot of damage with the ground bounce technique, so learn it, use it, and you'll probably win some more games. If you want to see more content, I got a bunch of videos coming up. Hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.